Welcome everyone, thanks for having me. So my presentation is just to kick things off, give a bit of background and context to TOD, or Transit-Oriented Development. And so roughly my presentation is going to go through what are the definitions of TOD and why is it so popular globally now, and what's the history of TOD within South Africa, and how's our context different to other contexts in which TOD has been implemented successfully. So the first is, what is TOD? The narrow definition is that it is a compact, mixed-use, pedestrian-friendly development around a public transport or transit station. And it started as a concept in the new urbanism wave in the United States in the 1980s. It came out of the ideas around how to create more sustainable neighborhoods when they're looking at creating these kind of pedestrian pockets around public transport stations, as sort of self-sustaining little communities within walking distance of one public transport station. And then as you connect these little pedestrian pockets along one public transport route, you get a kind of string of pearls development. And that was the start of transit-oriented development as a concept. And generally when we talk about transit-oriented development, people will think of something like this first. It is very walkable, kind of European-style cities, and that's also kind of the marketing brochure for TOD. And you get kind of slight variance on it. The Asian TOD is often higher density and a lot more pedestrian-oriented. And you have your South American TOD, which is geared towards the bus rapid transit. So therefore, because the stations themselves are less of an attractor, it becomes kind of a ribbon development stretching out from their downtowns. But this narrow definition doesn't cover all of the versions of TOD that have been implemented. In Venice, you have TOD, even though they don't really have large public transport stations. They have rivers to work on. In Medellin, in Colombia, they have cable stations, and their favelas have ended up having characteristics of TOD, despite not filling many of the criteria that one would usually associate with it. And finally, in our own city, in Cape Town, we see that our development around our public transport stations, our train stations, the formal development is often very oriented towards the automobile, where the informal development is oriented towards public transport. But TOD in the narrow definition is almost entirely predicated upon formal development. So based on this, we need often a more contextual definition of what transit-oriented development is. And for example, the Cape Town TOD strategic framework includes social equality and economic development within descriptions of what TOD is to them. Now, social equality or income diversity, these are not descriptions that you'll find in many definitions of TOD around the world, but they have particular significance to us here in Cape Town. So my personal definition of TOD generally is that it is a planning, design, and implementation approach to integrating public transportation and urban development in order to achieve economic and societal objectives. And so why has it suddenly got so popular? Now, I may be biased because this is where a lot of my research is, but I think it's because of this debate around public transport finance. In the 1950s to the 1980s, we didn't really have that many intensive debates around public transport finance because we were too busy building highways. And so when it came to the 80s, we realized we couldn't build our way out of congestion. Suddenly, the work of Newman and Kenworthy and looking at how densification, the density of our cities, can affect your public transport usage and financial viability of that public transport. Suddenly people started to look at the correlation between population density and the amount that public transport is used, or how successful it is, and therefore how financially viable it will be. Now, I know this made sense at the time, but the correlations were only strong when you looked at the cities in the developed world. We just didn't have the data back then to look at the developing world. And so there were a lot of the relationships drawn between density and public transport finance, or public transport success, that now have been brought into a lot of doubt. And so when we moved on from the densification policies, which worked for some cities but not for most, we moved on to BRT, something we know all too well in the 2000s. It promised, lower capital costs and free of operating subsidies. This was a public transport mode that was easier to finance. It was easier to support as a city. And so we had a boom of BRT that built within the 2000s. And again, it worked for some cities, not so much for others. And so really, it's come down to the key that this integration between your public transport and your city is far more nuanced than we wanted to admit. So the fact that cities like Cape Town just generally don't have a public transport supportive environment means that you have to look at every single facet of it individually. And that's where transit-oriented development really comes to the fore. It's about analyzing these linkages between public transport and urban development and how you can use one to affect the other in sometimes small but very significant ways. So the history of TOD in South Africa. I mean, the elements of TOD are in our policies. You can see them going all the way back to pretty much the advent of our democracy, the densification of our public transport corridors and mixed-use developments, the integration of land use and transport planning is all there. So really the TOD planning paradigm is just building on all the elements that are in our policies. And it's bringing it into kind of a more holistic perspective or a larger toolbox that we can now use to try to deliver on the policies that we have produced. And when it comes to the recent South African policy, it depends significantly on which department that you are consulting with, especially at the national level. National Treasury has actually been the first to really jump in and support TOD as a planning paradigm. And it makes a lot of sense because, as I've said, TOD internationally has been kind of promoted as a very good way in which to finance your public transport or make your public transport more financially viable. So the National Treasury programs have explicitly supported TOD as a concept, whereas our Department of Transport has been slightly more apprehensive to support it outright. It supports the characteristics of TOD, but has not come out and supported TOD as a concept within the latest plans or strategies. However, the most concern generally is for the Department of Human Settlements. This is because even the most recent plans have not included TOD as as an option in which to really significantly deliver housing opportunities. And looking at the potential that TOD could have to be able to deliver efficient, affordable, state-subsidized housing, it's going to be really problematic or really limiting to the success of our TOD if we are unable to tap into the funding streams that come with the Human Settlements Department. But when it comes to the research that we've done on TOD, we're actually blessed to have a greater history of TOD research than most developing nations. Going back to one of the most seminal pieces of research for us, 2006, Peter Wilkinson was looking at the way in which TOD could restructure South African cities and improve our public transport systems. And that's now 11 years ago. And so even then, he was outlining some of the major concerns that could arise from implementing TOD within South African cities. The fact that our transport authorities, which didn't even exist as authorities then, were so distinct from our municipal planning departments, and now have come together under TDA, which you'll be hearing about later, shows how much what we have achieved since then. But some of the things have stayed somewhat stagnant. For example, the professional practices, the fact that as a transport engineer, I'm still in somewhat of a silo away from a land use planner and from a property economist, shows that we still have a lot of progress to make before we can become the far more interdisciplinary professionals we need to be able to advance TOD as a concept. And he outlined the fact that South African cities are going to need a kind of a dualistic TOD framework. because as we look at the development around our public transport stations, it's going to either come in the kind of richer choice areas where the developments will be private sector led and it will be about a lifestyle choice, or it's going to be very much public sector led and it's going to be people living in those TOD developments without much of a choice. So the framework that we need to create and the processes that we go through need to be able to be cognizant of the fact that we have this dualistic TOD process or framework that we're going to be looking at. And so finally, what makes our context different? Well, I think the largest difference between us and cities throughout the world that have been trying to pursue TOD is the fact that our objectives for TOD are quite different. The objectives for TOD around the world have generally been to force people out of their cars, to get people out of suburbia and into the cities, to get people into public transport, onto the streets, to be more active. But we are asking TOD to make our suburbs more income diverse, to try to create some restorative justice for the apartheid spatial planning that has occurred in our cities, and to be able to efficiently deliver our quite immense program of state-funded subsidized housing. So because our objectives for TOD are quite different, or can be quite different, we're going to have to start looking at the more alternative approaches to how TOD is implemented or planned. And this brings us to kind of the cutting edge of where the research is at the moment. We're asking some very interesting questions now, like, can an informal settlement be TOD? Can organic, informal development within informal settlements and backyarders and these kind of this kind of informality, can that be a sustainable version of TOD? Can we use the National Treasury funds for these kind of informal settlement upgrades under the guise of TOD? And these are the kind of questions that we need to grapple with as we move forward and determine whether this is the planning concept that is most suitable, or the approach that's most suitable for public transport and urban development in our cities. I'd like to finish my presentation with this picture here, which is the Biblioteca de España in Medellin. It's the most beautiful library I've ever seen, and it's in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in Medellin. And they built this library there along with a lot of other civic institutions. And it's now become an attraction point, not just for the neighboring communities, but for tourists across the entire city and citizens across the entire country. It has been able to create organic TOD around it without the top-down planning system. They have developed their own mixed land use systems. They pedestrianize their own streets to be able to deal with the demand that has come through that public transport station that was strategically placed, or that this library was strategically placed next to. So even though the conventional idea of TOD as quite formally planned doesn't fit with this quite catalytic acupuncture development, it has been held up now as one of the best TOD developments within a low-income area. And we are going to have to start to look at some unconventional ideas like this when it comes to TOD. And I think that is where the true potential of this concept is. So thank you.